Hello there, it's Paul here and welcome on everyone. Last video I was talking about the powdered dyes which I dissolved in hot tap water from Bolgers, and I created this sort of like a colour wheel just to see what they're like when you mix them and stuff like that. So as you can see, some of those are really nice bright colours. Now, I've been having a bit of a play around with the colours and an item, and I just come up with that for a Christmas ornament. Now, I know the colours are a little bit garish, but this is all really about experimentation. There's three types of wood here. Now, the main body of this is mahogany, like I've got a piece on the lathe, which is a piece there. So it's fairly plain. You do get a little bit of grain in it, and at least with the colouring on there, it still shows up all the grain. That's the orange gone on there. The central band on here was a piece of beech. That was what was left over from when I made the salt and pepper mills. And for the finials, it's actually sapele on there, and I've coloured those yellow, so they look more like a bit of a roco. Now, I'm not a lover of the colours as they are, so I'm going to have another go at one of these and sort of run through the process of doing it, and hopefully do a little bit more decorating on the actual body of the piece. This is the bit of mahogany that I've got here in the lathe. It's just between centres at the moment, and the first thing I want to do is get a tenon on the end here, which will then go into my O'Donnell jaws. So it's about a 30mm tenon there, and as you can see, the jaws are not very deep, so it's got to be fairly shallow. Once I've got that mounted on the chuck, I can do some basic shaping. So it'll probably be something similar to this as well, just the two halves there. By putting this band in the middle is what I would do once I've got it on the chuck and I've done some basic shaping. I'll then put a tenon on this end, part this in half, and then I can hollow out the inside to make that as light as possible. Once I've got the piece of hollowed out, I will then drill the hole as the last point. So it'll be a 5mm hole going in the top here. The reason I do that last, once I've got it all hollowed out, is then it just stops the drill bit from wandering. And then once I've got the first one finished, I can then put the other one on the chuck and do exactly the same there. So both halves are really treated the same. Once I've got that, I can then know what size my band is going to be here, and then get that to fit onto a tenon on one of these halves. I've now got my two halves, and they're both very similar in shape. And all I've done here, I haven't took the ends down too much, because I still want a bit of meat there for while I do all the hollowing. I just want to take as much out of there as possible. I've got to make sure I just keep this tenon on here. That's where this sleeve will glue onto. So we just push over there and probably just glue onto the sides, and then glue onto the side here. And then at the same time, what I want to do is, once I've hollowed this inside out, I will make a tenon on here that just slots just inside there. So the idea is that when you put the two pieces together, they locate, and hopefully they should line up a lot better. Now, it's not essential that they're a really tight fit. Even if there's a mil or two wobble in there, at least it gets you sort of like in the ballpark for when you glue it up. Now, the outside shape here shouldn't change much more now. It will just be a case of that I will take it down more to a thinner point on the end here before I then sand it all up. Finish the shape on that. That I've took down as far as I'm going to go now. It's just under 10 mil. Bearing in mind I've got a 5 mil hole in there, so there's only about 2 mil wall thickness. So the next thing I need to do now is just sand all this off, and then I'll just literally part the top off, and I'll repeat the whole process for this one, except rather than creating this mortise tenon sleeve like this way, I just need to create a very, very small thin tenon on here which will fit inside this tenon. It doesn't need to be very deep, it just needs to be enough to locate in there. You can sand up the inside if you like. It's never going to be seen because this will all be glued together, but because this is a Christmas tree decoration, the lighter you can get these, the better. So therefore, I mean, if you sand the inside, you're taking more wood off, which therefore reduces the weight of the piece overall. So that top half has now been sanded to 400 on the outside. I've only just done 180 inside just to tidy it up a little bit and take out the weight on there. The walls on this are really, really thin. The reason I like to use the skew, I had the space here to use it. These fibres just don't tear up so much. If I use the parting tool, what you find is that they all break up and go inside and make a right mess. So just using the parting tool on there, and all I'll do now is I'll just sand this top off flat, and I'll just go through the grits to that and make sure this all sort of blends in a bit. Now I've just finished both halves here now, and there is a wafer thin tenon on there which fits in there a treat, so there's no wobble whatsoever, so it really does locate nicely, and the grain still lines up on here nicely. It'll be interesting to see how much of that we'll see when we get some colouring on this. Hopefully some of this should still show through fairly well. Now, if what I probably should have done on this is made this piece slightly bigger and had that tenon a lot thicker, because I'm now going to make my life a little bit more difficult for when I create the band that goes in here, if I still want to make use of that tenon. Because it's so thin, that's probably about 1 millimetre thick there. If I make the band more than 1 millimetre wider than this tenon on here, then this is just not going to locate into here because it's going to be pushed out further. So my next job, I've just measured the size of this tenon. It's 40 mil on my calipers, and I'll just mark it off on the end of this. I need to cut the inside out first of all, so that this will basically sit inside. Once I've done that, I can then take the outside down to the required size and just do any shaping. I believe this ring, I did say it was beech, it's actually sycamore, so apologies there. I've got a piece of beech in the chuck now, and I've already trued this up, and I now need to make the top cap for which the eye hook will go in, and also the finial itself. I usually just do the top cap, even though it's fairly long, it's fairly solid in there, and it's quite easy to just turn off, and even when I've got the tailstock taken away, it's still going to be fairly rigid. Now this doesn't need to be too big, even on this one. It's a 5mm hole, so I mean 10-12mm wide, something like that, and I just need to try and concave the underneath. I've tried to make these as flat as possible on the top here, so then if I do concave the inside, it will then hopefully just hide the joint a little bit. Tend to do the cap that way round off this piece of wood. It's easy enough to take the size of this step pin down that goes into the hole. It doesn't matter if it's a bit too small because the glue will go underneath as well. But the finial itself, I tend to do that way because it's so much longer. You want to work on this end point first of all. Yes, you'll have to take some material down to start with, but you can get that effectively end piece finished, sanded, and then work your way back as you go along. And when I do the colouring, it's still not such much problem, because I mean, if it's on there with there, you can spray it and you can sand it gently with holding it in place. Just sanded this to 400, and I've just put a small sort of centre point in there for where the eye hook has got a screw in. And I now need to decide on colours what I'm going to do here. But what I've got decided is that the main body of the piece I'm going to do hopefully as bright a yellow as possible. I want that as a base coat because I've got something in mind to try and decorate the top with. Centre band, I still don't know yet. The finials and end caps, it would be nice to have them stand out, but at the same time as well, I want some form of a contrast in the piece. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm actually going to do those black. So I've got a reasonable coating on there at the minute. Now it still shows up all the grain quite nicely, but I'm just going to let this dry. I'm going to sand it off and give this probably 2 or 3 more coats to really try and build up the black on there a bit, and just sand it between each time, because it will raise the grain a little. So that's the top cap. It's a nice tight fit on there, so I won't push it all the way in yet until I'm ready to glue it on. Gave this 3 coats in the end, just sanding back with 400 grit between each coat, and it's left it really smooth. And that's the one thing I found about these water-based dyes, is that when you give your first coat, it often raises the grain a bit. Second coat might do a little bit still, but after you sand it back a second time, it stays smooth, so you can then apply as much dye over the top as you like, and it shouldn't raise the grain anymore. So that's the cap. Now I've just got to do the finial. Now the definition of a finial is it's just a decorative piece on the either the top of something or the end of something. So there's no predefined way this has got to look whatsoever. It's just got to look at some form of a decoration that I'm going to have on the bottom. Now I know some people prefer not to have points on Christmas decorations because of young kids and stuff like that. So even though I've done a point on this one, I think what I'm going to do this time is with this one is I'm going to try and make it so it's more about things like curves, things like that, rather than pointed shapes that I've got here. Now I found yesterday when I played around with this that you need to ideally have the stencil touching the work, and I found also then having the air compressor on as low a pressure as possible. So I've got this at 15 psi. I'm not trying to put too much on. Finished all the colouring on there I'm going to do now. The good thing is with just doing like these stars with the stencil, they dry almost instantly. Just using ordinary wood PVA glue. Just run some around the inside here. That will not take long to go off and set. And this one, I'm just, because it fits fairly tight, just mainly putting it in the hole there. And fit the cap on. That will hold. So I'll just find an eye hook and screw that in there. And then we're going to look at putting some sanding sealer on and a finish. That one is now finished. I, over a course of a few days, gave this a few coats of lacquer. Yesterday I knocked it back a little bit with just using, I think it was the gold Web, and then I just gave it one more final coat. The finial on this I'm really pleased with. I do different styles every time. Both I really like. To give an example, that only weighs 20 grams. But this one, which is, it's not really that much smaller, it's slightly smaller, only weighs 10 grams, so it's actually half the weight of that. And if you really want to give that as a comparison, this AA battery, rechargeable battery I got here, weighs 30 grams. So it's pretty important to try and keep that weight down as much as possible, especially when these are all going to be hanging on a tree. Now for colour wise on these dies, I'm really impressed with these, and they do give a slight mixed result to what you might be expecting. This particular one, it was all about just seeing what it came out like, and the orange is nice and vibrant, the red on there is really vibrant, and considering that's sapele with the yellow what's gone on there, it's turned it more, looking a bit more like a piece of Iroko. With this one, I gave it a few coats of the yellow and the turquoise on the band there. The band, I absolutely love the turquoise colour. Now the yellow on there, I just thought, because it's such a bright yellow on here, I was going to get something similar on here. But these are dyes, and a dye will react with the colour that it's sort of touching, which is why on here, this is just a piece of pine, so it's very sort of pale in colour. These colours come out as their true colours. On here, it's a piece of mahogany, and this mahogany is that colour, so it's almost like a beige colour. And when you mix beige with yellow, you get more of that sort of darky, almost like muddy yellow. Whereas if you're going to use a stain, what you'll find is that you'll probably end up getting a bright yellow on there, because a stain tends to sit more on the surface rather than penetrate. I mean, there will be an element of wood penetration with a stain because it's a liquid. Now when I was doing that one, because I wasn't so sure about the yellow, I thought, right, I'll have another go with another one, and I will see if I can put probably 10 10 or so coats of the yellow on there, whether it makes any difference. And this is why I've now come to realise that the dyes work in that way of reacting with the colour they're doing, because there's another one I did, and the yellow underneath again is still like this one with that muddy sort of yellow colour. Now this one I've also done something slightly different as well. The band itself, I started off I think with the bright red, which I've got round there, and I think I put a couple of coats on, sanded it back so it's all nice and smooth and everything, and then I used the burgundy red that I got. Now the other thing as well with the finial and the cap on here, and I will hopefully show a picture on the side here, so it's, and I really do hope it shows the colour on here. This, if you look very, very closely at it, is almost like a very, very deep burgundy red. And the way I got around that one was, again, I sprayed it with the bright red. I think I gave it a couple of coats, knocking it back each time, so it was on there nice and bold and sunk into the wood. And then what I done then is I then just sprayed black over the top of it, slowly just building it up until sort of like the red sort of mainly disappeared, but there was hints of it through there. Now the other thing as well is, I mean, as you can see, that's just totally different with the patterns on here, whereas that one was with all the stars. I got some more stencils off eBay, so I've got the star stencil there, which is the one I used on the first one, and I also had this one with circles on, which I've not used, and I bought another set of stencils, which is, I think they were called something like French curves. There's these two, and I haven't even had this one out of the packet. There's a much, much larger one as well. All these stencils cost me, I think, about £2 or £3 each. Also, while I was doing this, I had the blue turn up, and hopefully you can see what the blue is like there. Thanks a lot for watching.